I must have the easiest introduction job of the whole conference, because you all know Michael Bentine very well. He was a tremendous help to us at our last International Congress, and he's being a tremendous help to us now. He's called his talk From the Ridiculous to the Paranormal, which is a good sort of Bentine's touch, and I'm sure gives us a clue to the man if you don't know him already. Anyway, here he is, Michael Bentine.
Thank you. Well, first of all, my mind's still whirling from those two marvelous lectures. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. How did I get into the paranormal? Well, I've been going around the country the last 7 years and around the world doing a little chat called From the Ridiculous to the Paranormal. I'll explain why. What I do for a living is totally ridiculous. Things like an invisible flea circus, the Goons show, Square World, the Potties, the Bumbleys. Totally ridiculous, you'll agree. The fact, no, thank you, but they are ridiculous. I mean, the Goons show was magnificent rubbish. That is the way to look at it. People say, yes, of course, it was deeply meaningful. It had a tremendous iconoclastic feeling in it. And I thought to myself, yin tong, yin tong, yin tong, yin tong, yin tong, ting lang po. Chap rang me up and said that he was doing a PhD on it. My instant reaction was, God, what a waste of public money. There we are. Now, how did we get involved as a family? Quite simply through my father. My father, as I explained earlier, was a very fine aeronautical engineer, great pioneer of radio too. Not radio too, I mean radio also. And when I was a very small boy, we used to build crystal sets. And I remember my father building a 16-valve superheterodyne in Folkestone. And when we finally switched it on, we thought, what distant radio station in the world will we pick up? And we picked up Folkestone Aberere. And it totally drowned out everything else until we managed to change the frequency. However, I remember my father saying to me, you know, Marconi was only half right. We shouldn't use thermionic valves. We should go back to using crystals. And my brother and I looked at each other and thought, oh my God, he's lost his Elgins. But I'm happy to say that my father retained his marbles. He was actually predicting what Richard Shockley did some 24 years later. So I've been brought up all my life, really, with, if you like, divining, dowsing, prophecy, prevision, whatever you like to call it. To me, it was never paranormal or supernormal. It was always normal. And when we were doing the experiments in the early 30s with telekinesis or psychokinesis, and we were using the old idea of using the heavy table and managing to lift it by just a contact. It took about 3 months to get it off the ground, but once then it was whizzing around the room about a foot above the earth, and we were saying to each other, yes, it's a marvelous effect, but what the hell is it all for? And when I used to go to other little boys' houses and none of the furniture moved on its own, I used to think how desperately deprived they were. I was born in Watford, as I explained, the only Peruvian ever born in Watford. And about a year after I was born there, my father contracted acute asthma. Now, this was caused by dope. I don't mean the dope that you shove or I don't mean that sort of dope. I mean the dope you put on the wings, the fabric-covered wings of aircraft. And unfortunately, he couldn't pursue his great love, which was aviation. He had worked with a wonderful man called J.W. Dunn. That was before the First World War, when Daddy was very much a pioneer, and one of the early men who used to come down to Farnborough and apply his mind to the problems of flight. And J.W. Dunn was one of the great pioneers of flight. Very few people have heard of him. It may be because they read a book of his, which was quite a brilliant book in 1929, called An Experiment with Time, which I recommend to everyone. And that was a quite brilliant book. So they think of him really as a philosopher. And basically, he was a superb aeronautical engineer. The problem, of course, was spinning. So many young pilots in 1913 were being killed by spinning. And Father had this vision of somehow, if they could make an aerodynamically stable aircraft automatically, they would cut out the spin factor or reduce it considerably. Dunn went much further than that. He produced the first Dunn automatically aerodynamically stable aircraft. I assure you, no matter what you did to it, it could not spin. It also couldn't turn. They went down to Salisbury Plain to try this really revolutionary aircraft, except that it couldn't turn, of course, out, and there were a lot of, if you'll excuse the word, generals, admirals, and in those days the RFC wasn't even formed, so there weren't any air marshals. And Mr. Dunn got in it, and they spun the prop, she was a pusher, and he took off and flew in a dead straight line, clean out of sight, and disappeared over the top of the hills, and everybody took their hats off. And half an hour later, the aircraft returned. Mr. Dunn, having landed it, got out, turned it round, and taken off again. Now, when Father came up against this slight problem of acute asthma, he went to a specialist who said, "My dear sir, what you need is Folkestone on the southeast coast. Folkestone is marvelous for asthma." So he spoke with such conviction that my father and mother sold up and took my elder brother and myself down to Folkestone. And of course the specialist was absolutely right. Folkestone was marvelous for asthma. It nearly killed my father, but it gave it to him 7 days a week. This precluded much industrial activity, but he was able to take up golf, and eventually in 1929 he won the borough of Hythe, the only Peruvian ever to win it. So that was very exciting. It also got him much fitter, and then due to a series of accidents, all were they accidents, I think they were designed, he became involved and interested with what is now called the paranormal. In those days it was called the supernormal. This happened in a small bungalow at Hawkinge, which is the airfield above Folkestone, famous in the Battle of Britain. It's one of the oldest aerodromes in England, and of course nowadays the property developers are going to make damn certain it's blasted off the face of the earth. However, there it is. Now, Folkestone played a great part in my early youth because it was the center of all the research that my father and his team of scientists was engaged in. Father, once he got his teeth into anything, did it totally, absolutely, and included his family. So my elder brother and I became his guinea pigs. He had a good team. He had a physicist, he had a chemist, 3 doctors, a surgeon, and the personal private secretary to General French in the First World War, who was called Major Webster, who was a great conjurer and a member of the Inner Magic Circle, and Arthur Condy of Condy's Fluid, who was also a member of the Inner Magic Circle and a superb illusionist. So between them, they could not only test whether the mediums, especially if they were physical mediums, were genuine, but the conjurers and illusionists knew exactly what sort of tricks they might pull. Quite a number of them tried it. My mother, I remember shooting down one phony. We're talking about 1929, 1930 now, so it's only 10, 12 years after the First World War, and practically everybody in Folkestone had lost somebody in the First World War. I remember very few parents, the male parents of my school chums, who were whole. They were missing an eye, missing both eyes, had a hacking cough from the gas. They're missing one arm, both arms, maybe both legs. And yet those wonderful men used to play with their children just the same as if they were totally whole and enjoyed it twice as much. It was a wonderfully exciting era in one's life. Now, Mother destroying a phony was something to see. It really was wonderful. I remember this chap looking at her and saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa," then looking to see if there's any reaction. And I saw Mother's mouth become very small. It was a very generous mouth, and suddenly she looked like a chicken about to lay an egg. And I thought, this bloke's in dead trouble. And she smiled at him with steely blue eyes and said, "Is that you, Obadiah?" And I thought, Obadiah? The heck's Obadiah? And he swallowed it hook, line, and sinker. He said, "Yes, Flo." Now, my mother's name was Florence, and she answered to Floss, but she hated Flo. And the eyes became even steelier, and the mouth even more determined and smaller. And she said, "It's a miracle to speak to you, Obadiah." He said, "Yes, it is," she said, "especially as you're a dog." However, when we were examining the phonies, we used to get the self-deluded. Now, Mother was never unkind with the self-deluded, but it was fairly obvious they're the sort of people who went to a sitting, a seance, what have you, and no matter what the medium said, "Oh yes, it's so true, dear, oh yes, absolutely, oh no question," you see. And they weren't really the sort of city you need if you're doing research. We used to get what we used to call the regulars through the mediums. Napoleon Bonaparte here. But he couldn't speak French, which we spoke fairly fluently. We had Count von Bismarck, who couldn't speak a word of German. And on one glorious occasion, which I've never forgotten, I was a boy about 14 by then, Queen Victoria here, Her Majesty Queen Victoria, Victoria Vagina. I have never forgotten the impact of those years. However, what we were really testing was the validity of the predictive content of the genuine mediums. And by golly, when you met one, you knew about it. I think you almost felt it as soon as you doused them, I suppose. You picked up their aura, you could see their aura anywhere, and it was genuine, it was lovely, and it had a lovely feeling there. And we had wonderful people like Estelle Roberts, Mrs. Helen Hughes, Mrs. Sinclair Stobart, extraordinary people, Joseph Benjamin, when he was a very young man, Arthur Baduri, who was an Indian medium who taught me scrying, most fascinating character. And we had some wonderful results. The sort of thing that really blew one away was when you met a little lady in Sandgate who was an automatic writer, and she talked to Billy Kent like that, you know, "Oh, you come from Felton Fleet, oh, how lovely." She had 2 pots which were filled with sharpened pencils, and she had 2 blocks of paper. And as soon as the automatic writing started, this hand was writing academic German and very obtuse and absolutely correct mathematical problems, and this one was writing academic French of philosophy. Well, she was saying, "Oh, really? And you wear that cap, don't you, with a little top on," and all that business again. That woman, who had nothing to do with the content of what she was writing, must have been one of the most extraordinary automatic writers ever, certainly as good as John Alleyne, who, as you know, worked with Bly Bond. A wonderful medium called Eddie Partridge. Now, Eddie Partridge I will cite as a marvelous example of a total sensitive. He also was a dowser, a very fine dowser. Eddie was small. He was the proprietor of a tiny corner grocer's shop, which wasn't called Patel, it was called Partridge. And because we have some wonderful friends over here who run these little corner shops now, the only corner shops that really work. Eddie had the same sort of shop, but he was totally illiterate. He could neither read nor write. So stock taking should have been a complete nightmare. But his son, who was a manager in Boots, I mean, he wore shoes like everyone else, but I mean, he was Boots, the chemist, used to put it down for him. He'd say, "All right, Dad, what have we got?" And he said, 24 tins of biscuits, and he went through this long list. And then he said, "And the value of it all is," and it came in pounds, shillings, pence, and farthings. And about a week later, after the son had checked everything, it came to the nearest farthing. And Dad said, "How on earth do you do it?" He said, "Oh, I just ask for help and I get it." Now, he was a man who was quite extraordinary. He was a psychokinetic, which I think to a certain extent the strongest dowsers become. The ability to move objects, I think, would be a fairly logical step for the dowser to take if that is what interested him. Certainly healing would be an awfully good stage for development. In Eddie's case, it was an extraordinary ability to materialize. Now, we had our two experts from the inner magic circle. They knew if it was phony. We caught a number of mediums swallowing muslin and then regurgitating it, supposedly ectoplasm. On the other hand, we got many photographs in infrared light, and remember, infrared photography was in its infancy at that time, and they were exuding it from the thyroid, and you could see the stages in which it was developing, and then it would form into a pseudopod and go and lift something, or it would pick up a pen and write all sorts of extraordinary things. Now, if you show the photographs, they just say, fake, I know cotton wool when I see it. You had to be there to know that the photographs were genuine. One of the most extraordinary cases of that was Father went up to work with Frank Myers, who was a psychic photographer, who was a dentist. He and his brother were both dentists. They lived in Wandsworth. That's a fairly banal sort of place for the sort of happenings. Dad took his own camera, his own film. All that Myers did was he seated my father down, he touched the camera and pressed the shutter, one of those bulb shutter things. And then they went into the dark room and Father developed it. And there's Father, and there's his mother, and there's his father. So it was my grandmother and my grandfather. Absolutely clear. It's one of the most extraordinary photographs. If you take it to show anybody, they say, clumsy fake, so you've got no chance. Eddie had a wonderful experience. I remember he was a famous breeder of racing pigeons. And the breed is called Champion Eddie, very famous throughout the world. And at one sitting, which was a materialization sitting, experimental one, a pigeon in red light appeared on Eddie's head, totally solid. It then took off and flew around the room several times, returned to Eddie's head, and dematerialized. Now, the reason I know it was genuine was that it didn't deposit a visiting card on anybody on the way round. There's no way he could have palmed it. There's no way he could have produced it and then dematerialized it. I've worked with the top magicians in the world, people like Cody Cadell, Channing Pollock, who work with birds, and they've got tubes up every orifice, and it takes about an hour and a half to load them. And they always come on looking massive, and they always walk off looking very thin and covered in bird droppings. Eddie was a magnificent healer as well, and he was a wonderful person in himself. He was a small, vibrant man, most lovely personality, totally normal, very happily married to Biney, also a little lady, a very bright son, and friends everywhere. One of the funniest things that ever happened with him was in the shop. My father was discussing various aspects that they were going to use in an experiment, and Eddie had on his counter a huge brass scales, one of those massive cast iron brass scales he used to have, with the big weights and the little weights and everything. And suddenly the door burst open, and full of beer and bonhomie, a biscuit salesman came in from a firm who shall be nameless, but whom for the sake of argument we'll call McVitie and Price. Walked in with one of those clipboards and said, "Hello, Mr. Partridge, yeah, McVitie and Price, yeah. Let's see how the old biscuit steaks are, yes? Oh, the bourbons are a bit low. Sorry to see your Garibaldi's. Oh, they're nearly out." And all Eddie wanted to do was to say, "Thank you very much, just get the biscuits and out." But he's a very shy man. And suddenly the 10-pound weight went, whoo, bang! And the biscuit salesman said, "What the man was that?" And Eddie, a very shy man, he said, "Probably the wind." To which the biscuit salesman said, he didn't say blowed anyway, he said, "Wind be buggered, your bloody shop's haunted, mate," and out. I had a wonderful experience with Eddie. Like a lot of other young people, I was getting very concerned with the approach of war. I found myself, almost preoccupied by the feeling that it was coming. You felt that in the East there was something incredibly evil which was building up. And Father noticed this because he was sensitive, and he said, "Come see Eddie." And Eddie said, "What's the matter, mate?" So I told him, and he said, "Well, I'll show you something. That'll balance it out." And he got Dad to drive us. He shut the shop. It was about 7 o'clock at night. And it was that lovely, balmy autumn in 1939, just before it all blew up. And we drove out into the Weald, which I loved dearly. And I remember there was about 5/10 cloud, a moonlit night, absolutely beautiful, high, lacy clouds up there. And stopped the car at a valley. And Eddie said, "This is what I want to show you, Mike." And he led the way. We walked down into the valley, Eddie leading, myself behind him, and Dad on the end. And we came to a wood, this beautiful wood, very pretty wood. And we were walking through that very thick, drying bracken. And I suddenly realized we weren't making any noise. Somehow we were brushing aside the bracken without that crackle and back and all the things that go on when you walk through bracken and dead twigs. And we went deep into the wood and deeper, and it got darker and darker, but it wasn't alarming. It was so lovely to be with my father and his great friend and my friend. And we came out into a clearing about 4 times the size of this lecture hall. And the moon came out from behind a cloud, and I could see it was the most peaceful scene I think I'd ever imagined, or ever seen, or ever thought of. There is a phrase, "a peace that passes all understanding," which is not far off what one felt. And I relaxed. And the moon was shining on Eddie's face as he turned around. He said, "Eat." And then he made a sound. And I've tried to describe it many times, and I always fail. The nearest approach that I've got to it was something between a whistle and a word. Very quiet. And instantly, every bird, every beast, anything that chirped or cawed or barked, dog, foxes, everything answered him in one huge shout of welcome. It was undoubtedly the most magical experience that I had ever hoped to know. And at that moment, my fears just vanished. During the war, they came back at various times, especially when I was in the RAF. But I suppose the most extraordinary demonstration, if you like, of the predictive side of the paranormal or supernormal, which is really in the realm of the dowser and in the realm of the psychic and the sensitive, was when a woman medium said to me when I was 14 years old, "You are not going to be an RAF pilot officially," which I desperately wanted to be. "You will never design airplanes like your father," which is all I wanted to do. "But you will become a great success in the theater and on the stage in many parts of the world." Now, at that time, I stammered so badly that I was literally a type of stammerer. The reason, I had a tonsillectomy when I was 3 years old on the kitchen table, which wasn't child abuse, it was normal practice. They scrubbed it, and then they put clean sheets on it, and you lay there, and the officiating surgeon, because after all he was only going to remove my tonsils, would scrub up with a bit of alcohol, put the tea strainer over your face, a bit of gauze on it, and drip the chloroform on it. I remember all that, and I can't stand that sickly smell ever since. Now, he would have done a wonderful job, because he was a very fine surgeon, had he not been blind drunk at the time. The result was he removed most of my nasopharynx at the same time. And ENT specialists looking down my throat, because I still get trouble, open it up and say, "Here's the," and it looks a little like the Somme. Even after all these years, there's mold growing on it, but that's about it. Now, the idea of my ever becoming an actor was so remote and so incredible, there was no chance. It all came about because at Eton, my tutor, Bill Hope Jones, said this is all wrong for the boy to walk around with a notebook, writing down everything, both in division and in his normal course of life. We must get him speaking. And brought in a speech trainer, huge man, 6'4", Harry Burgess. And he said, I will teach you to speak with a swing and a rhythm and a pause and a run. And I thought, I think I prefer the car, but we found out various things. Firstly, a stammerer can always say no. No. Yes is very difficult. No, you see. So if a pretty girl said, would you like to come for a walk with me? I'd go, oh, no. So it made a meaningful relationship with the opposite sex almost an impossibility till I was 16 and a half. And the first time I learnt to do it was when I walked into the school sock shop and I said, may I have a fish cake? And they were used to me walking in with a pad, you see, on which I would write the fish cake. And they went, oh, in amazement. And the little old dear behind Roland's counter said, oh, I don't see why not, dear. Would you like a codfish cake or a salmon fish cake? And I went, and wrote cod. And I lived off codfish cakes for several months until I learnt to say no bangers and no mash. So there it was. The idea of going on the stage was so remote, and the only reason I did was because, being a foreigner, the RAF very wisely would not have me, even though I volunteered solidly for 2 years. And each time is, yes, so you can fly an airplane, first class. You went to eat. No, well done, well done. Your father's a Peruvian. I said, yes, and I'm jolly proud of it. And he said, I'm sorry, we can't have non-Europeans in the RAF. Next, you see. I eventually found this wonderful man, Robert Atkins, and when I said, no, I would like to become a Shakespearean actor, he thought, well, that's an unusual interpretation. Now, in Shakespeare, it doesn't matter if you do things like that. People say, what a brilliant interpretation of the part, you see. But at first, I was only allowed to stand there holding a spear. And I used to stand there holding a spear, looking very noble. And Robert said, no, no, Michael, you're supposed to react to what the other actors and actresses are saying. React, boy. So when we went on the next night, I reacted.